Askreddit asks, would you support airlines creating child-free flights? Why or why not?
I would prefer flights without people who stand in the aisle while people are boarding.
I would prefer flights without other people.
Or just have airlines board people back to front. Boarding would take like 10 seconds vs 10 minutes.
A perfect flight is one where everyone checks in their luggage except for a small carry-on. Overweight people get appropriately sized seats instead of taking half of their neighbor's seat. You have some space between your knees and the seat in front of you. The seats have restricted inclination so no one has to have someone else's head in their lap. The Wi-Fi actually works and is free. The outlets work and can charge your device. The snack and drink is actually a snack and drink, not 1 ounce of warm soda and 3 pretzel sticks. Your fellow flyers took a shower that morning. People are generally quiet and polite. Doesn't seem like much to ask for. But to get all this on a transatlantic flight would cost you upwards of $10. per seat.
On some East Coast trains, Amtrak made quiet cars where silence is king. I'd support quiet flights where the only sounds are the engines. Occasional pilot announcements if entering turbulence, etc. And the flight attendant's cartwheels wobbling down the aisle.
I fucking love the quiet car.
I like the idea, but how do you enforce it? If someone's loud in the quiet car, you make them get on another car. If someone's loud on the quiet plane, you hand them a parachute.
I feel like instead of child-free flights, there should be a family section on the plane separated from the other seats.
There is on some 757s. I have named it Purgatory. It's in the back end, behind the 2 mid-lavs. Smells terrible, like a porta potty, in the floor. Don't ask me about the floor. Oftentimes that's where families with children end up assigned. Not always, but often enough.
I've had more problems with adults being loud and obnoxious than children. I'm not really for child-free flights, but I've also never had a bad experience with children on a flight. I haven't had any bad experiences with children either, but I have been bothered by a super noisy bachelorette party led by a bride-to-be who loudly described the sexual encounter she had on their trip with someone who was definitely not her husband-to-be. A stinky guy who periodically shouted, "Free beer," during the 2-hour landing delay. A would-be grad student who asked me to proofread his admissions essays. And a countless number of assholes who managed to hog the entire overhead compartment.
I wouldn't go out of my way to support or avoid it. I'm going with the cheapest flight at the best time that works for me. I'd rather spend my money on a fabulous dinner and drinks once I get to the destination. Plus, you know the airplane is going to suck anyways. Spend the least amount possible and knock yourself out with some anti-anxiety meds.
This is probably the real answer. Do we want child-free flights? Yes. Are we willing to pay more than a standard flight for the experience? A. Not really.
We all want a fast, pleasant flight, but when you put a price tag on it, most of us would probably wait all day for a ride in a hot cargo bin if it were just $1 cheaper.
I'm 100% for child-free flights, but in this case child cannot be simply defined by age. If there's a 2 years old that is behaved and not causing problems, then I'm cool with that. The fucking 40-year-old dude that is yelling and hollering needs to be out of there.
I log probably about 100 flights a year for work. Kids aren't really a problem. The worst was a kid crying most of a cross-country red-eye. But that was years and years ago. Most kids will cry for 5 to 10 minutes at a time. And if it really bothers you, a decent set of noise-canceling headphones will run $300 tops. Far less than an airline would charge you for 2 to 3 child-free flights.
The overall discomfort of the seating in coach on most airplanes, exacerbated if you're tall. The person in front of you reclines. You're sitting in between people too large for their seats, etc. Contributes way more to the awfulness of a flight, in my experience, than kids ever have.
First class is generally child-free if you're willing to $.
I flew business, there is no first class for the route I took, and encounter a demanding yelling 6-year-old and an 8-month-old that cried the entire 5 hours. The air hosts offered compensation because of how awful it was.
I've started paying for priority seating to get away from the kids. I had the row right after first class. I was so excited. This would be a great 6 hours flight. Mum has child in first class. Screams entire ride. Luckily alcohol is free in priority seating.
Maybe I'm just lucky, but I've never found children to be such a big deal on airplanes. It's not like it was gonna be quiet anyway, and most times I have headphones so I barely hear them anyway. But sure, if people want it then go ahead. As long as I can go on the child flights for cheaper.
No, you're correct. The issue isn't the kids on the plane or the parents of those kinds. The issue is with people who are overly worried that the kids might be a problem. I've flown a lot over the last 15 years, and it seems to me that people are so upset by the inconvenience of dealing with the TSA and waiting in lines for food or for their turn to board the plane that everyone becomes super selfish. In my recent experience, people seem to be becoming more and more rude and less agreeable these days.
I used to fly frequently and now fly only once or twice a year. Children, occasional problems, rare even. Adults, basically an inversion of that. Person of size, elbows, kicks to the seat, grabbing the seat to stand up. Smelly, using the tray table as an elbow rest and can't sit still. The list goes on. How about child seat discounts?
Or the guy who the stewardesses don't cut off and is totally drunk.
Lol, persons of size, alternatively dieted.
Okay, story time. When I was around 16, we went on a family holiday to Barbados. This started with a 1-hour flight from Edinburgh to London Gatwick, where we'd catch our flight to Bridgetown. So in the check-in line at Edinburgh there's a family. 2 parents, 1 daughter maybe my age, possibly a wee bit older, and 3 kids under 10. The wee ones are running around all over the place while the parents seem to ignore them. We think, fine, it's a general British Airways check-in. They're probably flying to Heathrow. They weren't. They were 2 or 3 rows behind us. We get through Gatwick connections and security and don't see them, so they're probably at a gate across the airport. Yeah, they weren't. As we're boarding the plane we see them sprinting towards the gate. And of course they're in the 2 rows in front of my family. Oh, and this is an 8-hour overnight flight, so we're in for a night of no sleep. The kids were out of control. Screaming constantly, climbing over the seats, running up and down the aisle, even into first class, much to the anger of the first-class stewardess, and no matter what other passengers and crew say. The parents just won't do anything. That was a very long 8 hours. Thankfully they weren't staying at our hotel and we were staying for the unusual length of 12 nights, so there was no chance they'd be on our flight back. Take a guess what happens next. Luckily they were right at the back for the long flight and nowhere near us on the short jaunt back up to Edinburgh. In short, I don't support child-free flights. I support shitty parent-free flights. TLDR, awful family of awful kids with awful parents ruined 2 8-hour flights.
Airlines don't give a fuck about your being bumped or delayed. About smashing or losing your luggage. About your missing your connection or your legroom. Or about people in zones A and B using all the overhead compartment room for zones A, B, C, and D. Why do you suppose they'd give a rat's ass about your preference for having no children around you?
Money.
To be fair, Ock didn't say that airlines care enough to make the change. He just asked what we would think if it did happen. As a dad who's traveled with babies, I wouldn't be offended by this. If you want to pay a premium to avoid the chance of being annoyed by children, I think everyone wins.
I think most parents would definitely opt into this. Knowing that people had to opt into flying with my kid would give me about half the anxiety as I experience now, trying to not ruin everyone's flight who had no choice in flying with us.
The last flight I was on, I was right next to a young mother and her 6-month-old child. About 30 minutes into the flight the baby starts crying, and instead of being annoyed I just started making faces and trying to help. Same with the woman across from us, she even pulled up cartoons on her iPad. The mum was super apologetic and I felt so bad for her because people were giving her dirty looks like she ruined their life.
You're a really good person for that. A lot of people don't realize unless she's a shitty mom and truly doesn't care. Moms don't want their baby crying. High altitudes hurt a baby's ears, which is why they cry on flights. Thank you for not getting angry at a woman because her child was in pain.
Most of these comments are referring to babies and toddlers. So I'll assume that's what you meant too. For shorter flights, I would guess you can influence this based on when you fly. Parents typically either want to try to fly while the child is sleeping, or while the child is awake. They don't want to try to put the kid down for a nap. It just wouldn't work. So parents with babies will often fly red-eye, so the child will theoretically sleep the whole way, and I would guess that parents of toddlers would avoid early afternoon flights. The airline should have better data on that. They might be willing to share it with a customer trying to book a flight.
Misanthropic Inc. I have always had this fantasy of starting a misanthropic franchise which would provide absolute comfort to people-hater people. Movie theaters, restaurants, hotels, flights, buses, etc., all provided with a team of social surveillance. For example, one guy in a movie theater is paid to look out for obnoxious people. You allowed, you get one warning before you're kicked out. Your kids are crying. Sorry. Same. No more super fancy anniversary dinners spent next to an excited and loud family with no other table option. Etc. This would make some experiences 100% safe for comfort for people who for some reason, controlled or not, have zero tolerance. I am kind of this person. Although I've made a lot of progress these past few years. Because I suffer from a terrifying pelvic chronic pain which is somewhat made worse by irritation and annoyment. I avoid a lot of things which I used to love out of fear that someone or something might annoy me and that I'd have wasted my money on just forcing myself through irritation and pain.
I fly home 3x a year. On my trip home I always fly a red-eye. About 2/3 of the flights there are usually at least one not very happy child. The last 2 flights the kids, under 2 I'm guessing, literally screamed, cried for 5 of the 6-hour flight. When I travel back the opposite direction and am not in red eyes I don't think I've encountered a single situation with a crying child. Don't know if this is merely a coincidence or not. That said, I would happily pay a little more money for a childless flight if it was a red eye. Flying is an anxious experience for me as it is, and I have Tourette's syndrome, not verbal tics, which gets extremely hard to control, manage when I'm anxious. Having an experience of prolonged screaming on an overnight flight is beyond challenging for me. To the people that are making blanket statements about shame on you for even entertaining such a thing, are clearly not remembering that there are people in this world going through things like anxiety, depression, general fear of flying among other things, and a screaming child can magnify this in a lot of cases, especially if the child is not able to be soothed. In my situation I'm using child, and really am talking about infants. In no way am I blaming the infant or the parents for not being able to soothe a screaming baby. That said, though I'm not upset with the parent's infant directly, it does not make my personal situation any more easy.
In theory, sure. How it's implemented may change my mind, though.
I mean, if they were priced the same then sure. I'd choose the child-free flight. I wouldn't pay extra just to avoid the chance of a crying child though. I can just put in headphones and be fine. I wish restaurants offered with kids sections and no kids sections. Kinda like the old smoking, non-smoking sections. Nothing is worse than trying to go on a nice date and have it ruined by shitty parents letting the children run around, scream, climb all over the back of the benches, etc. Then I get called an asshole when I ask them to make the kids act right.
100% for it. I have 2 kids. Traveled with both. One was really good, the other a shriek monster. Felt bad for all the other people on the flight. Give them an option. I am in support of child-free just about everything. Restaurants, flights, video game servers, anything I do when my own kids are either in bed or home with a babysitter. I want to be able to do in a kid-free zone.
I was on a 10-hour plane ride from France to Texas where someone had a baby 2 rows back from me that screamed for 9.5 hours of the flight. I could hear it over my music while heaving headphones on. So yes, I would be support long flights, specifically having child-free flights.
My wife and I flew back from Mexico recently. There were several children on the various flights we took to get there and back. Some were infants, and some of those infants cried. I still don't know why parents insist on bringing infants of flights. But whatever, I put on some headphones and listened to some music to drown out the crying. NBD. However, on the last flight back home, we sat amongst a large group of teenagers, high school, college age. When I say large, we're talking 20 to 30 kids. This flight was single-handedly the worst flight I've ever had. Those kids were the definition of obnoxious. We're talking seat kicking, screaming, pranking, spitballing, littering, listening to awful music on speaker, seat swapping, standing in, crowding the aisles, bugging the flight attendants every 30 seconds for sodas. And no end of that immature, squeaky giggling that teenage boys do when they're doing something stupid, annoying and they know it. They had one chaperone from their school who came over at one point and said to try to keep it down. But that was it. I looked up their school when we landed. They were from some rich boarding, sports prep school. Probably returning from a game or something. So if they make flights that can weed out those crowds, then I'll happily sit next to screaming babies in a cramped coach seat.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to support the channel, and above all, have an excellent day, you incredible people.